The wind carried the sound of a hammer striking wood, sharp as judgment in the quiet morning. The town square of Dust River was no stranger to noise, but this sound was different. It wasn't the cheer of cowhands after payday or the thud of wagon wheels rolling toward the livery. It was the hollow, merciless knock of the sheriff's gavel. Each strike declared what the paper nailed to the post already spelled out. The Hanlon family's indenture was up for auction. The mother stood straight, though she had every reason to break. Her name was Clara, and her eyes, though rimmed in weariness, still carried a glint of iron. At her side were her 3 boys, clothes patched more times than the seams could bear. The eldest, Daniel, tall for his 15 years, kept his arm firmly around the shoulders of his younger brothers, Luke and Sam. Together, they looked like saplings braced against a storm. The sheriff's voice rang out. Family indenture 3, years service, bonded under the authority of this town to pay back the farm debt. Opening bid? There was no pity in the faces gathered. Dust River was hard country. Men here had buried wives and children beneath the prairie sod. They knew hunger. They knew drought, and they knew that weakness drew wolves. Indentures were business, not charity. Luke, the middle boy, clutched at his mother's skirt. "Ma," he whispered. "What's happening?" She pressed a hand to his cheek, whispering back so only her boys could hear. "Whatever comes, we stay together. Remember that." The sheriff raised his gavel again, impatience etched into his jaw. Then, from the edge of the crowd, a slow shuffle of boots cut through the silence. A stranger. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a trail dusted, had pulled low against the sun. His coat was plain, patched at the elbows, but the way he carried himself made men step aside without thinking. His name was Caleb Warren, a rancher from the far edge of the valley, though few in town knew more than rumor about him. "What's the bond?" Caleb asked, his voice even. "Farm debt and interest. $120, the sheriff replied. "Plus court costs." A murmur rose through the crowd. That was more money than most men could scrape together in a season. One rancher near the back spat into the dirt. A fool's price for worn land and hungry mouths. But Caleb didn't flinch. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. Coins clinked heavy as he set it on the table. "I'll pay it." Gasps rolled through the square like a sudden wind. Clara's lips parted, but no words came. The sheriff leaned forward. "And what claim do you make?" Caleb's gaze swept the crowd, steady as a man setting fence posts. "A season's work. They'll come to my ranch. I'll put them to task until the bond is settled." Clara stiffened, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. She had endured her husband's debts, his drinking, and his death. She would not see her boys turned into beasts of burden under another man's hand. But Caleb didn't look at her with the cold appraisal of a creditor. He looked at her boys, and in that moment, she saw something different. Not pity, not calculation, something nearer to recognition, as if he'd once stood where they stood now. The sheriff hesitated. "Legal, yes. Customary, no. You'll house them, feed them, and see them safe until the bond is worked off?" "I will." It was settled. Caleb extended his hand toward Clara. She did not take it, but she lifted her chin. "My boys don't break easy," she said quietly. Caleb gave a single nod. "Neither do I." The crowd dispersed slowly. Gossip carried on the wind. Some muttered that Warren was soft-headed, buying debt when land was already choking from drought. Others whispered of darker motives, of a man too long without family. Clara held her sons close, her heart pounding with the knowledge that their lives had just shifted onto ground she could neither trust nor escape. That night, the family rode, with Caleb out past the edge of town. His ranch lay quiet beneath the rim of the hills, fences in need of mending, barns sagging, the soil as thirsty as any in Dust River. It was not much better than the farm they had lost, but it was space enough for a start. The boys were given cots in the loft, while Clara sat by the fire, her hands twisting the fabric of her skirt. Caleb set down a tin cup of water in front of her. "You'll have wages and food and roof," he said plainly. "Work's honest. That's all I can offer." Clara's voice was steady, though her heart trembled. "And when the season's through?" Caleb stared into the flames, their light carving hard lines into his face. "Then the bond's yours again. If you want to walk, you walk. If you want to stay, we'll speak of it then." She studied him a long moment, searching for cracks in his resolve. There were none. She nodded once, not in agreement, but acknowledgement. In the loft above, Daniel lay awake, staring through the gaps in the boards to the firelight below. He had heard every word, and though he was too young to be called a man, something in his chest tightened with the weight of it. He would not let this stranger carry their burden alone. Outside, the prairie wind moved restless through the dry grass, whispering of trials yet to come. Morning came with silence too heavy to trust. On Caleb Warren's ranch, dawn usually meant the chorus of cattle lowing, the scrape of boots on gravel, the clang of a pail against wood. But this morning, the family rose uneasy. The boys moved slow, their bodies still remembering the auction square, the shame of standing for sale. Clara cooked cornbread over the hearth, though her eyes kept darting toward the door, half expecting some rider to come claim what wasn't theirs to give. Caleb stepped inside, brushing dust from his hat. He didn't look at the family so much as through them, as if weighing how this choice would fit into the bones of his land. "Day starts early here," he said. "Fences need checking, cattle run lean. I'll need hands in the field and steady work from the rest." Daniel squared his shoulders. "We can work." His voice cracked with youth, but the steel in it caught Caleb's attention. The boy had his mother's stubbornness, but also a fire of his own. By mid-morning, the family had taken to the chores. Daniel carried fence rails on his back until sweat ran down his neck. Luke fetched water from the creek, hauling it in pails too heavy for his narrow arms. Little Sam tried to help feed the hens, scattering grain with more excitement than sense, earning a scolding cluck from the birds. Clara patched torn work shirts at the porch table, each stitch biting into her thumb. Caleb moved among them, saying little, but watching how each task fell into place. The land itself groaned under drought. Grass thinned to brittle stalks. The well gave water grudgingly, and every bucket lowered seemed to scrape at the earth's last reserves. Dust clung to boots, coats, even lashes, a constant reminder that nothing in Dust River came without a fight. That night, Daniel sat on the porch, carving wood with his pocket knife. Caleb lowered himself onto the step beside him, the boards creaking. For a while they said nothing, just listening to the dry wind. Finally, Caleb spoke. "You've got hands for more than just hauling rails," he said. "That whittling takes a sharp eye and patience." Daniel glanced at the stranger, then back to his carving. "Doesn't feed us." "No," Caleb admitted. "But it builds something. And building's what gets you through when the land's against you." Daniel didn't answer, but the words rooted deeper than he wanted to admit. By the week's end, news traveled fast. The town's creditor, Mr. Harlan, came riding up the ranch road in a black coat too fine for the dust. He carried papers, thick with seals and signatures. Caleb met him by the corral. "You paid their bond," Harlan said, his smile too polished. "But debts run deeper than coin. Their farm contract lists future yields, land rights. I've proof. Hear that the family owes further." He held out the forged document. Clara stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "That's a lie. My husband's accounts were closed when you sold our land." Harlan's smirk sharpened. "Paper says otherwise. Sheriff won't stand against signed contract." Caleb studied the paper but didn't touch it. His jaw tightened. "You forged this." "Call it what you like," Harlan said. "But unless you've a mind to test it before the judge, you'll find the law isn't cheap. And the family. He let the words hang, dripping with menace. "They'll be mine. Again before the season's through." He spurred his horse and rode off, dust swirling in his wake. Clara's hands shook at her sides, but her voice was steady. "He'll come again. Next time with law at his back." Caleb didn't answer right away. He looked at the boys, then back at Clara. Something in him shifted, a weight settling that had nothing to do with money. "Then we'll fight with what we've got, and what we've got is work." The following days were a test. The drought worsened, sucking moisture from soil and skin alike. The creek thinned to a trickle. Men in town spoke of leaving, of taking their stock north where rain still fell. But Caleb set his jaw and pressed on. He gathered the family by the well one afternoon, handing Daniel a length of rope. "We're going deeper," he said. "If the ground's dry, we'll cut until it yields. No water, no living." Daniel stared into the dark hole, then looped the rope around his waist. "Lower me." Luke and Sam gripped the line with Caleb, lowering their brother into the earth. Clara watched with a prayer caught in her throat. Daniel's voice rose from the shaft. "Stone here, but it's weak. We can dig past it." So they dug. Day after day, blistered hands pulling dirt and rock from the earth's gut. Clara carried water to cool their brows, her own hands raw from hauling buckets. Sam, too small to lift heavy loads, fetched nails and rope, learning the rhythm of labor. Together, they fought the drought not with wealth or law, but with persistence, and, slowly, almost miraculously, damp earth came. Daniel's design for a crude windlass, an idea sketched in the dirt with his pocket knife, allowed them to draw heavier loads without breaking their backs. Caleb watched the boy's mind at work, pride glinting like sun on steel. By nightfall, they would sit by the fire, exhaustion heavy but spirits oddly lifted. For the first time since the auction, Clara allowed herself to laugh when Sam tumbled into her lap covered in dust. The boys began to look less like victims and more like men in the making, but shadows still gathered. Harlan's words lingered, and the law in Dust River had long favored those with the heaviest purse. Caleb knew the well was more than water. It was proof they could survive without bending. And survival in this land was the only argument worth making. The town whispered louder than the church bell. In Dust River, nothing stayed secret long. By the third week of Clara and her boys working the Warren Ranch, talk had spread down every street and over every fence line. Some said the widow had sold herself cheap. Others claimed Caleb Warren had finally lost his mind, taking on debt-ridden mouths in a season of drought. At the mercantile, Clara felt the eyes. She had come only for flour and salt, but each step down the aisle was dogged by whispers. Women who once traded recipes with her turned their shoulders. A man near the counter spat into his tin cup and muttered, "Strays don't belong on another man's land." Clara kept her chin high, though the shame burned. She would not let her sons see her break, not after they had faced the auction block. But Daniel saw it anyway. He caught the twitch in her jaw, the way her hands trembled when she counted coins. Outside, Caleb was waiting with the wagon. He noted her stiff shoulders as she climbed aboard, but said nothing. His silence was not dismissal, but a kind of shield, as though he carried her burden without needing it named. That evening, the family returned to the ranch to find a notice nailed to the gatepost. Sheriff's seal, Harlan's hand. Caleb tore it down and read aloud. Summons for court. Harlan's pressing claim on the indenture. Luke's face paled. Does that mean we have to go back? No, Caleb said firmly. It means we stand before a judge and let the truth weigh heavier than his lies. Clara studied him. And if the judge's scales are bought? Caleb met her eyes across the yard, his voice low but certain. Then we build something no paper can take. The well stood half-finished, its windlass creaking under Daniel's design. The boys worked late, lanterns swinging as they pulled up buckets of clay and stone. Clara carried water from the trickle of creek, mixing it with flour for bread that barely stretched. Caleb hauled fence posts until his shoulders burned, repairing the boundaries of land that might yet be taken from him. At supper, they sat cramped around the table. Sam, too small to grasp the depth of things, grinned with flour on his cheek. "When the well's done, can we fill the troughs, and maybe Ma can wash clothes without carrying so far?" Daniel ruffled his brother's hair. "If it runs deep enough, you'll have water to swim in." For the first time in weeks, laughter broke around the table. Even Caleb allowed himself a crooked smile, quickly hidden behind his cup. But the night was restless. Caleb heard the horses stir, then the faint crunch of boots beyond the barn. He stepped outside, rifle in hand, only to find a warning carved into his fence rail. "Debt follows." The next day, the family walked into town for court. Dust clung to their boots as they entered the cramped wooden building. Harlan sat smug at the front, papers spread like weapons. The judge, gray-haired and weary-eyed, adjusted his spectacles. "Mr. Harlan," he began, "you claim further debt owed?" Harlan rose smoothly. "Indeed, this contract binds the family to me beyond what Sheriff Walker sold. They owe seasons more, land rights, yield, all duly signed." He waved the forged paper. Clara's heart thudded. She wanted to cry out, but Caleb placed a steadying hand on her arm. Then he spoke. "Your Honor, the man's contract is false. I paid the bond in full, witnessed by the sheriff and the town. These people owe him nothing." The judge frowned, weighing the air heavy with tension. Harlan leaned in, voice slick. "And what of Warren's motives? A stranger pays a widow's bond. Why? To claim her as wife? To bind her sons to his ranch? This is not charity. It is theft in disguise." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Clara rose, fire sparking in her voice. "You speak of theft? You stood ready to sell my children like cattle. This man," she gestured to Caleb, "kept us together when you would have scattered us to the wind. Whatever his reasons, they are not yours to soil." The room stilled. Caleb's gaze flicked to her, unreadable, but there was a glimmer in his eyes she hadn't seen before. The judge struck his gavel. "Enough. I will review the papers. Return in 1 week for decision." Outside, the crowd buzzed. Some sneered, others whispered approval. Clara held her boys close, her heart still, pounding with the raw truth she had shouted. Caleb walked beside them, silent but steady, his presence as solid as the fence rails he drove into the ground. Back at the ranch, Daniel unrolled a scrap of parchment. He had been sketching ideas late into the nights, a stronger windlass, gears, shaped from oak, a way to draw twice the water with half the strength. He spread it on the table before Caleb. "It'll work," Daniel said, eyes alight. "Not just for us, for the whole valley." Caleb studied the drawing, then looked at the boy. "You've got more in you than most men twice your age." Clara touched Daniel's shoulder, pride softening her tired face. For a fleeting moment, the threat of Harlan's papers seemed far away. Here was proof that survival was more than endurance, it was creation. But as the lantern flickered, shadows danced on the wall, whispering of the week to come. A week in which law might betray them, or bind them closer than ever. The drought did not forgive, and neither did men. The sun bore down hard, stripping the land until even the sagebrush curled brittle. Caleb's cattle grew lean, ribs showing like rungs of a ladder. Wells across Dust River ran shallow, and whispers spread that the town itself might not last another season. Yet Harlan's threat lingered heavier than the sky. The summons had given them 1 week. Each day that passed wound tighter around Clara's chest, each hour a reminder that paper and coin could outweigh flesh and blood. Still, life on the ranch demanded labor, not fear. Daniel worked at the windlass sketch by lamplight, carving gears from oak planks scavenged from the barn. Luke and Sam hauled buckets of clay from the new well shaft, their laughter breaking through the silence of despair. Clara patched clothes, until her fingers blistered, then baked hard bread that tasted of grit more than wheat. Caleb drove fence posts until his hands bled raw, then rose the next morning to drive more. On the fourth night, a storm swept the hills, not rain, but dust. The wind clawed at shutters and rattled the barn roof. Caleb and Daniel scrambled to tie the livestock, while Clara pressed the younger boys into the cellar, holding them close as dirt seeped through every crack. When the storm passed, the ranch looked half buried. Fence rails had toppled, shingles torn loose, feed scattered. Sam coughed through a throat lined with grit. But the well still stood, its windlass creaking strong, Daniel's design holding despite the storm's fury. Caleb stood beside the shaft, lantern light casting his shadow long across the yard. He said nothing, but Clara saw his shoulders ease for the first time in weeks. The boy's invention wasn't just clever, it was survival. That night, after the children had fallen into exhausted sleep, Caleb remained by the fire. Clara lingered too, hands folded in her lap. Silence stretched between them until finally she spoke. "You could have left us there," she said. "At the auction. No one would have blamed you." Caleb stared into the flames. "I've seen too much of families broken. Army years, border posts, men traded land for liquor, wives left behind to bury children alone. When I saw you and those boys—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. "I couldn't watch it happen again." Clara studied him, her voice quiet. "You lost someone." His eyes flicked to hers, and for the first time she saw the weight behind them. A wife, Sarah. Fever took her the year after we came west. We had no children, just this land. I buried her under the ridge where the grass still grows in spring. The fire crackled, filling the silence. Clara's throat tightened. She had known loss too, though in a different way. Years of watching her husband drown himself in debts and whiskey until death claimed him as much a relief as a sorrow. She whispered, "I'm sorry." Caleb nodded once. "Grief doesn't vanish, but it teaches you what matters." He lifted his gaze, steady now. "And I'll be damned before I let a man like Harlan take what's left of yours." Clara felt heat rise in her chest, not from the fire but from something more dangerous. Respect, trust, perhaps even the first flicker of hope. The following day, Harlan struck again, not with words, but with men. Two hired hands rode up, faces hidden beneath dusted hats. They left a dead calf at the edge of the property, throat slit clean. A warning. Daniel found it first, his stomach lurching. Caleb dragged the carcass away, fury simmering beneath his calm. "He wants us scared," he said. "Wants us broken before we walk into court." Clara's voice shook. "If the judge takes his word—" Caleb cut her off, steel in his tone. "Then we give the judge more than words. We give him proof." He pointed toward the well. "That boy's design could water this whole valley. You think Harlan can claim indentures when the town itself depends on what we've built?" The idea struck deep. Survival wasn't just about their family anymore. It was about Dust River itself. That night, Caleb and Daniel worked side by side, fitting gears and ropes, crafting a frame stout enough to draw twice the buckets. Luke fetched nails, Sam held lanterns, Clara mended torn gloves. They were no longer debtors bound by auction, but builders, their sweat woven into the bones of something greater. Still, shadows pressed close. Court loomed, and Harlan's smirk haunted Clara's dreams. She woke one night to find Caleb at the table, papers spread before him. "What are those?" she asked. "Deed to the ranch," he said quietly. "It isn't much, but it's clean. If the judge won't honor truth, then I'll offer a bond stronger than coin." He hesitated, then looked up. "A proposal, not just of land, but of family. If I marry you, no court can split you apart from me." Clara's breath caught. Marriage. The word struck like a hammer, sudden and final. She stared at him, searching his face for hidden motives. But there was no greed in his eyes, only the same weary determination she had seen the day he stopped the auction. "You'd bind yourself to us," she whispered. "I already have," he said. For a long moment, neither moved. The firelight flickered, catching the lines of hardship carved deep into both their faces. Clara thought of her boys asleep upstairs, of Daniel's sketches, of Luke's laughter, of Sam's endless questions. She thought of the auction block, of Harlan's forged papers, of the weight of survival in a land that never forgave weakness. And for the first time, she considered not just endurance, but belonging. The law rode in with dust on its boots and hunger in its eyes. The week ended with a chill in the air, though no rain came with it. Clara rose early to find Caleb already saddling his horse, jaw set hard. Today, the summons would be answered. Today, the town would decide whether truth could stand taller than money. They rode in together, Clara seated in the wagon with her boys, Caleb alongside, rifle holstered at his side. The townsfolk had gathered thick outside the courthouse, whispers rising like wind before a storm. Some nodded with quiet respect, others sneered openly. Inside, Judge Pritchard presided, his gavel resting heavy as if already tired of the day. At the front, Harlan stood flanked by 2 deputies.
He carried himself with the smug ease of a man who had long bought verdicts like cattle. "Court will hear the case of Harlan versus Hanlon," the judge began. "Claim of continuing debt and rightful indenture." Harlan spread his papers wide,
Seals gleaming. "Your Honor, as shown in these documents, the widow and her sons remain bound by contract. Warren's interference was unlawful, a theft of service. I demand the family return to my estate." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clara gripped Luke's hand until his knuckles went white. Caleb rose slowly, his voice like iron hammered flat. "Your Honor, the sheriff witnessed full payment of debt. These papers," he gestured to Harlan's stack, "are forgeries, written after the sale. The man's claim is smoke dressed as law." The judge leaned back, eyes hooded. "And your proof, Mr. Warren?" Daniel shifted beside his mother, then pulled from his satchel a rolled parchment. With trembling hands, he stepped forward. "Sir, we built something. A windlass, my design, that brings water deeper than any well in Dust River. It's not just for us. It could keep this town alive through drought." A hush fell. Judge Pritchard adjusted his spectacles, squinting at the crude sketches. "Harlan," scoffed, voice oily. "Child's drawings. This is not a matter of invention, but of law. The widow owes me, and her boys are mine to bind." Clara surged to her feet, her voice sharp enough to cut the air. "You would have sold them like beasts. This man," she pointed to Caleb, "kept us together. Is that the law you uphold? To reward deceit and tear apart what God himself has? Left his family?" The room stirred, townsfolk murmuring. The judge banged his gavel. "Order!" But the tide had shifted. Caleb's voice followed, low but unyielding. "A man's worth isn't written in ink. It's written in sweat and the lives he protects. Harlan would bleed this valley dry. These people," he gestured toward the benches crowded with farmers and ranchers, "they know what drought means. If this well holds, no one will walk away thirsty." Eyes turned from Harlan to the family standing shoulder to shoulder. For the first time, Clara felt the weight of the town's gaze soften, suspicion melting into something like hope. The judge cleared his throat. "The court will recess for consideration." His gavel struck, dismissing the room. Outside, the square buzzed with tension. Harlan's deputies lingered like wolves, their hands never far from pistols. He leaned toward Caleb as they passed. "This isn't finished. Paper or no paper, I'll have what's mine." Caleb met his eyes without blinking. "You'll choke on what you're after." Back at the ranch, the family worked harder than ever. Caleb refused to let fear eat the hours. Fences were mended. cattle driven to what grass remained, the windlass reinforced under Daniel's hand. Clara baked bread for neighbors who had begun to visit, curious about the new well. Each time she saw their eyes widen at the sight of water hauled easily from depths others couldn't reach. Whispers turned to talk. Perhaps Warren's ranch would see them all through the drought. Yet danger pressed close. One night, a shot cracked through the dark, splintering the barn door. The boys dove for cover, Clara pulling Sam tight against her. Caleb rushed outside, rifle raised, but only hoofbeats echoed away into the distance. A warning. The next morning he called the family together by the corral. Dust clung to his beard, but his eyes burned clear. Harlan won't stop. If the court bends his way, he'll use law to take you. If it doesn't, he'll use lead. Either way, we stand together. Daniel's jaw tightened. We're not afraid. Caleb looked at Clara, his voice softening. But fear isn't what binds us. If the judge rules wrong, I'll do more than fight. I'll make it so no one can ever split you from me again. Her breath caught. She knew what he meant, though the words hadn't yet been spoken plain. And for the first time, the thought of marriage, born not of necessity but of choice, didn't feel like a shackle, but a shield. That night, as lantern light flickered over the table, Clara caught Caleb watching the boys, pride and protectiveness mingling in his eyes. And she realized, with startling clarity, that the stranger who had stepped from the crowd at auction was no longer a stranger at all. But in the distance, a storm brewed, of dust, of law, and of men bent on breaking them. The knock at the door came like a gunshot. It was just past dawn when Caleb rose to stoke the fire. Clara was kneading bread, the boys still drowsy in the loft. Then, 3 sharp raps rattled the frame. Caleb's hand went to the rifle, by the hearth as he opened the door. Sheriff Walker stood outside, flanked by Harlan's 2 deputies. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, his face lined with unease. Behind him, Harlan waited on horseback, smile coiled like a snake. Warren, the sheriff said, voice heavy. Court's ruling came through early. Judge Pritchard sided with Harlan. Claims stand. I'm ordered to deliver the family back into his custody. Clara's breath caught, dough slipping from her hands. Daniel leapt from the loft, fists clenched. No! Luke and Sam pressed close to their mother, eyes wide with fear. Caleb's voice was iron. The judge took a bribe. Walker didn't deny it. His gaze flicked, shame heavy. Doesn't matter. I've got my orders. Harlan leaned in his saddle. Best step aside, Warren. You can keep your pitiful ranch. The woman and her brats belong to me. Caleb's jaw locked. They belong to no man. The deputies moved forward. Caleb raised his rifle, not aiming, but enough to halt their steps. The yard hung in silence, dust swirling like breath held too long. Clara stepped forward, voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. Sheriff, you stood at that auction. You saw what was paid, fair and legal. Will you now stand for lies because— Silver changed hands? Walker shifted, his shoulders sagging. Clara, I don't want trouble. Then do what's right, she snapped, her voice ringing across the yard, or you'll answer to more than one widow in this town. The sheriff flinched, caught between law and conscience. Harlan's face darkened. Enough of this. Deputies! Before he could finish, Daniel stepped forward, holding up the plans to his windlass. His voice cracked with urgency. If you take us, you take this too. The well works. It can save Dust River. Without it, your cattle will die. Your families will thirst. Is that what you want? The deputies hesitated. One spat into the dust, but neither moved closer. The sheriff's eyes darted to the well, rope creaking under the morning wind. He knew the truth. Harlan snarled. They're mine by law. Caleb's rifle came up, leveled at the creditor's chest. No, they're mine by choice. And if you step 1 foot closer, this ends here. The standoff stretched, brittle as glass. Then hoofbeats thundered from down the road. Neighbors, farmers, and ranchers rode up, drawn by word of the judges. Ruling, they fanned into the yard, hard faces weathered by drought and debt. One man called out, "That well's the only water in 3 miles. You take them, you damn us all." Another woman shouted, "We won't see children dragged from their mother." Harlan's smile faltered. His deputies shifted uneasily as more voices rose, a tide he couldn't bribe or buy. The sheriff lowered his gaze, shame pulling at his features. "I won't enforce it," Walker muttered. "Not against this." Harlan's fury blazed. "Cowards, all of you, you'll regret this." He wheeled his horse, spitting dust as he rode off. The deputies followed, though their eyes lingered with unease. The yard erupted in voices, neighbors demanding to see the well, asking about Daniel's plans, pledging help to deepen the shaft. Clara gathered her boys close, her heart still pounding, but her eyes lifted to Caleb. He stood steady, rifle lowered, though his hands trembled from restraint rather than fear. Later, when the neighbors had gone and the ranch fell quiet again, Clara approached him by the well. Her voice was soft but certain. "You stood for us today." Caleb looked at her, the weight of years and loss in his eyes. "I'll keep standing, but standing isn't enough. Harlan won't quit. The only way to protect you, truly protect you, is to bind this family in a way no judge or sheriff can undo." Clara's breath caught. The firelight of the morning sun burned across his face. "You mean marriage?" He nodded once. "Not out of charity, not out of pity, out of choice. I won't see you sold again, and I won't see these boys call another man master." Tears pricked her eyes, but she held them firm. For years she had endured a loveless union, a husband who dragged her into ruin. But here stood a man who offered not chains, but shelter. Not shame, but dignity. She whispered, "If we do this, it's for them." Caleb's voice softened. "And for us, a family built, not bought." Above them, Daniel watched from the loft. Window, heart swelling with a mix of pride and relief. For the first time since the auction, he believed their future might hold more than survival. It might hold belonging. But in the valley below, dust still hung heavy. Harlan's retreat was not surrender, only delay, and the storm he carried would return, fiercer than before. The valley held its breath the day Harlan came back. Word spread faster than wildfire. Harlan wasn't finished. By week's end, riders brought news. He was returning with hired guns, not papers. Dust River had seen its share of range wars, but this was different. This was one man's spite against a widow, her children, and the rancher who dared to stand between. The morning of his return, the sky hung gray with heat, the air sharp as if the earth itself waited for violence. Caleb stood at the corral, tightening the cinch on his horse. His rifle leaned within arm's reach. Clara came from the house, the boys at her heels. "We can leave," she said softly. "Take the back trail, head north until this blows over." Caleb shook his head. "Running only makes us pray. If Harlan wins here, he'll never stop. Better to fight with the ground under our feet than spend years glancing over our shoulders." Daniel stepped forward, jaw set. "Then we fight." The ee sound of hoofbeats answered him. Harlan rode at the head of 6 men, their guns gleaming in the sun. They pulled into the yard, scattering dust. Harlan's smile was wide, but his eyes burned with venom. "Thought you could shame me in court? Thought you could turn this valley against me?" He spat into the dirt. "I'll burn this ranch to the ground before I let a boy's toy and a widow's whining cost me my claim." Caleb stepped out, rifle slung low but ready. "This ground isn't yours. Neither is this family." The men dismounted, hands on revolvers. Clara gathered the younger boys behind her, though she stood, tall, unyielding. Daniel moved to her side, gripping the handle of a pitchfork like it was a sword. Then came the sound that shifted everything, the creak of the new windlass. Neighbors had gathered again, drawn by the promise of water and the threat of blood. Farmers, ranchers, wives with babes in arms, all stood beyond the fence line, watching. One by one, they stepped closer. "You won't touch them," an old rancher barked, musket in his hand. "That well's our lifeline. Harm them, and you harm every one of us." Another voice rose, a woman's, clear and steady. "No law stands with you, Harlan. Only your greed." Harlan's fury deepened, but his eyes flicked to the growing crowd. He had counted on fear to keep them silent, but thirst had stripped that away. "Step aside, Warren," he snarled, "or I'll bury you in your own dust." Caleb's voice cut through, calm as stone. "You'll try." The first shot rang sharp. One of Harlan's men jerked his pistol up, but Caleb's rifle barked faster. The man cried out, dropping his weapon as he stumbled back. Chaos erupted, neighbors shouting, dust swirling, guns drawn. Daniel lunged forward using the pitchfork to shove another rider back against the fence. The man cursed, scrambling away under the jeers of the crowd. Harlan fired wild, his bullet splintering the well's frame. Clara pulled Luke and Sam close, shielding them with her body, but Daniel shouted, "The rope! Don't let it snap!" Together with Caleb, he lunged to steady the windlass, their hands burning as the gears ground. The crowd surged forward, seizing Harlan's men, disarming them one by one. At last, only Harlan remained, his horse dancing beneath him, eyes wide with rage and fear. He leveled his pistol at Clara, the barrel shaking. Caleb stepped between them, his voice like thunder. "You point that at her, you'll never ride out of this valley alive." For a long, shuddering moment, the yard was still. The crowd's fury pressed heavy, the sound of the windlass groaning like judgment itself. Harlan's hand trembled, sweat streaking his temple. Then, with a curse, he dropped the gun into the dust. The neighbors closed in, dragging him from the saddle, binding his hands with rope. Sheriff Walker appeared at last, drawn by the noise, his face pale. "You'll stand trial for this, Harlan. Theft, forgery, attempted murder." Harlan's voice cracked, desperate now. "This isn't over." But the crowd drowned him out, their voices rising together. "It is." Clara sagged against the fence, her boys pressed close around her. Caleb laid the rifle aside and met her eyes. The fight was done, but the weight of what came next pressed heavy between them. Daniel straightened, dirt streaking his face but pride shining in his eyes. "The well held," he said quietly. "We held." And for the first time since dust, River's drought began. The valley felt the stir of rain, not in the sky, but in the hearts of those who had chosen to stand together. When the dust settled, silence spoke louder than guns. Harlan was dragged from the yard, bound and beaten not by fists but by the weight of the town's judgment. His men scattered, their courage blown away like dry leaves. Sheriff Walker, shamed by his own hesitation, swore before the neighbors that Harlan would face a real trial, this time with witnesses who would not be bought. For the first time in months, Clara felt her lungs fill with something more than fear. The crowd dispersed slowly, but not before many came to the well. They watched Daniel's windlass draw bucket after bucket, each lift steady and true. Rough. Hands cupped water to cracked lips. Women filled pails for their homes. Children laughed at the cool splash. It wasn't just water, it was hope, pulled from the gut of the earth. By evening, only the family remained. Clara stood by the porch, her boys clinging close while Caleb leaned against the fence, sweat streaking his brow, rifle finally laid aside. For the first time since the auction block, the air between them felt free of weight. Daniel broke the silence. "What happens now?" Clara looked at Caleb, searching his eyes. He met her gaze without flinching. "Now we build. But not as strangers. Bound by debt. As family." The words hung in the air, not demanded, not pressed, but offered like open ground. Caleb stepped closer, his voice low. Clara Hanlon, I stood in that square because I couldn't bear to see you torn apart. But I ask you now, not as protection, not as bargain. Will you stand with me, as wife, as partner, as mother to this home? Her throat tightened. She saw the boys' faces, Daniel proud and steady, Luke with hope sparking in his eyes, Sam grinning as if he already knew the answer. She thought of the years of hunger, of shame, of standing alone. And she thought of this man, weathered and scarred, who had given more than coin, who had given choice. Tears burned, but her voice was clear. Yes, the boys whooped, laughter breaking free. Luke clapped Daniel on the back. Sam darted around the porch shouting, "We've got a pa!" Clara pressed a hand to her lips, overwhelmed, while Caleb removed his hat, holding it against his chest as if the moment itself was holy. That night, they shared a simple meal, bread and beans by the hearth, but the room felt fuller, warmer, alive with something deeper than survival. Caleb sat with Sam asleep against his shoulder, Luke leaning close to his mother, Daniel sketching new designs by firelight. The sound of family, not silence. Weeks passed, and the well became the heart of Dust River. Ranchers brought their herds, mothers their pails, children their laughter. Daniel's design was copied, improved, and spread through the valley, keeping the drought at bay. Where once they had been whispered about as debtors, now they were spoken of as builders, saviors of the town's survival. And through it all, Clara and Caleb stood side by side, not strangers, not bargains, but bound by choice. On a bright Sunday morning beneath the shade of the ridge where Caleb had once buried Sarah, the preacher spoke the vows. The family's hands joined as one, neighbors surrounding them in witness. Clara wore no finery, only her patched dress, but the light in her eyes outshone any jewel. Caleb's voice, when he said, "I do," was steady enough to shake the ground itself. From that day forward, the Hanlon boys called him Pa without hesitation. And when rain finally broke across Dust River months later, pounding the dry earth into mud, it fell on a family no longer marked by debt, but by devotion. Some men leave their mark in silver, others in law. But the ones remembered are those who choose family where none was owed. In Dust River, folks still tell of the day a stranger stopped an auction, paid a bond, and married a widow not for gain, but to keep her children whole. And when the wells rope creaked in the valley wind, they say it was more than water that rose. It was hope. If this story spoke to you, don't just let it pass. Share it, carry it forward, and remember, love built in hardship is the kind that lasts. Ride with us again for more tales of grit, justice, and chosen family.